The thing I think I learned that really struck me tonight was it's a lot more fun to ask the questions than to answer them. And so we need to do that a lot more often. But I got a lot of input just in these last few minutes that folks really appreciated the chance to hear the candidates go into a little more depth about what they believe, how their beliefs and philosophy apply to the policies that they're suggesting, the changes in Washington. So we want to talk a little bit, I don't know how much about the individual candidates, but overall. But I'm going to go to Professor George first, let him kick us off, and then I'll go to Representative Steve King, and then whatever they leave out, I'll try to add. How about that?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Senator DeMint. And once again, let me thank you and Congressman King for partnering with us at the American Principles Project for this important debate. I think we did show today that it can be done differently and it can be done better than it's done, especially when the debate is controlled by the media and when candidates are incentivized to give stock answers or stump speeches or canned answers to what are very often gotcha questions. You notice we didn't ask any gotcha questions. We didn't ask any of the candidates who is the president of Azerbaijan. And we didn't ask any trivial questions. We didn't ask anybody, including Mr. Kane, who made his fortune in the pizza business, whether he liked deep dish or thin crust pizza. Our questions were serious, and they did go to the level of principle, trying to understand how each of the candidates would approach the challenges that we face today, many of them daunting, some of them unprecedented, in light of the principles on which our nation was founded. Our goal was to give each candidate the opportunity to demonstrate to the American people the depth of his or her understanding of our civilizational and constitutional first principles and the strength of their conviction to actually govern in accordance with those principles if elected. Now, you all, I'm sure, have made your own judgments on the merits, assessed the candidates, or you're in the process of doing that. I'll speak for myself in saying that I thought all of the candidates acquitted themselves well, and I'm grateful to the candidates for engaging with us in a serious way. I don't think that their answers were the stock answers or the stump speech answers. They were willing to go back and forth with me and with Senator DeMint and Congressman King to try to get a little deeper. Now, you know, each candidate had only 22 minutes, and each of us as a questioner had only 6 minutes and 25 seconds. That's a very limited amount of time. Maybe it didn't seem that way to you, but it sure seemed that way to us up here. I was always left with more questions to ask, or follow-up questions to take us deeper, and I'm sure my colleagues up here feel the same way. But I do think we got somewhere, and the most important thing is I think we set an example for how it can be done, that we really can make our foundational principles salient again. Our conviction is, and I hope and trust that I speak for Congressman King and Senator DeMint. In fact, I'm sure I am, because I know how they've conducted their public lives. I speak for all of us when I say that we believe that despite the new challenges, despite the daunting challenges, despite the unprecedented challenges, we don't need to discover a new set of principles or a new constitutional scheme or go down the road of European social democracy that the Obama administration is taking. And no, we don't need that. What we need is renewed fidelity to our nation's founding principles. Congressman King?
Well, thank you, Dr. George, and I want to especially thank the American Principles Project here and the Palmetto Freedom Forum, Jim DeMint, for hosting this and bringing this together. I look here and I get a sense of the greatness of America, and I have, for a number of years ago, I would say that around my neighborhood, I went to church with and lived as neighbors with the best people in the world. I understood their values and their constitutional understanding and their commitment. But I didn't travel enough in those years to see the cells of greatness of America like is in the crowd here today and scattered all across this country. And I think there's a huge debate going on. And this debate was mentioned here tonight in a significant way by a number of the candidates. The argument becomes, are we going to return to constitutional principles? And all of us here are here because we say yes to that. And the another question, the Keynesian economics came up. Is this going to be a consumption-driven economy, or is it going to be a production-driven economy? Those two principles, I think most of the rest of the things we talk about hang somewhere within those discussions, and I'm glad to have heard the candidates flesh this out to some degree. I, like Robbie and I think Jim, would have liked to have had, not 22, but 222 minutes to have this discussion. I had many questions I would have liked to have asked, but it opened the door, and it narrowed some things down, and there were some clear, definitive answers that I think put some of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together for us. And hopefully there are Americans that were inspired by these candidates, and hopefully they were also found a way to start to come behind a candidate of their choice. For me, I think there are a number of candidates up here. Actually, every single one of them would make a better president than the one we have. That's And so I just say thanks South Carolina. Iowa thanks South Carolina. Iowa thanks New Hampshire. Iowa thanks every state that steps forward to help select the next president of the United States. And when you think about the terms of the influence that you have as an individual on a per capita basis here in South Carolina or any of the early states, it is significantly out of proportion to the rest of the country, which I think you deserve. But it's a heavy responsibility, and I'm encouraged. I know you're stepping up to it. Thank you.
Senator DeMint and I are going to get microphones and come out into the audience, and you can ask questions of the panelists too as we do that.
We've got a few names we're going to start with out here that we're going to go to Chad Conley and Speaker Bobby Harrell and Ken Cuccinelli and Jennifer Horn, then Jan Michelson in just a moment. Just a comment myself, Dave, before you hand that to Chad. I learned a lot from these candidates today, and I think it's a good reminder for me that if you give this time, we can find out what these candidates really stand for. So again, I encourage folks who have not already made a commitment to continue to listen, because many times what we think of these candidates has been defined for us by either their opponents or the media before we ever get a chance to meet them. And forums like this, we can see what they really believe, and if they're able to translate those beliefs into policies, and if there's a real integration of principle by what they really believe. And you can tell by what they say and what they don't say what they really stand for. So all my questions weren't answered, but I realized that everyone who was on this stage today had a lot of strengths and a lot of things to learn. And even those candidates who don't win the nomination have ideas that I think our nominee will eventually pick up. And so I think we're learning from each other, and we just need to continue the process, because really the country and maybe the world, it's counting on South Carolina to pick the Republican nominee that can win this election. But not only that, but will stand up for those principles that make this country great. So, David, if you would just go to Chad Conley there and hand him the microphone.
Chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party.
Yes, sir. How you doing today? I want to tell the gentleman, thank y'all for standing your ground on the format. As a lot of us, maybe not everybody knows, but this really came together the last couple of weeks, and it was Senator DeMint and his strength of backbone, really, to hold this together, and maybe the media criticism and whatnot. But some of the candidates were a little slow to commit to this, but they came on board because of him. And I'm just really proud of this, because it gave people substance, not the sound bites, not the snippets, not the media-driven message. It's what they really wanted to say, and we got to know them a lot better than we ever would have.
You think we might see more forums like this because of the success of this one?
It would be a great service to the American people if we did.
Okay, very good.
Is Speaker Harrell still here?
Speaker Harrell? Yes.
Hey, David. Jim, this has been great, and I'm so proud of you guys for putting together this particular kind of forum. If the American people get to see this kind of discussion out of our candidates, we've always said that our views are the views that the majority of the American people believe. If they get to see this kind of forum, rather than seeing the 30-second, minute-and-a-half debates that they normally see, our ideas will absolutely prevail in the end. I'm certain that's where this will end up going. I think you may have changed the way debates occur in the future, because this is what the American people need to see. I was particularly pleased to see also to see the depth of each of our candidates who spoke. You know, sometimes the media is giving these folks a knock, and they're talking about them like they don't know the issues that well, or just not speaking of them negatively. What we saw today was 5 people I started to say a hot seat, but they were standing. But 5 people in the middle of that stage answering hard questions, knowing questions were going to come back, repeat our follow-up questions were going to come, and handling that well under fire. So that we know that we've got, as you just said, Congressman, any one of them is going to be better than President Obama. We're absolutely certain of that. What we saw tonight is proof that these folks have the substance to be President of the United States. And as my friend Chad Connolly is fond of saying, in South Carolina, we pick presidents.
Thank you, Speaker. Dave, right next to the Speaker, Attorney General in Virginia, Ken Cuccinelli.
Well, thank all of you. I think you did an outstanding job today, and I really agree with the Speaker. You're going to shift the paradigm, at least for primary debates, not only away from media-run events, but toward substance, which is absolutely critical. And I want to particularly comment that I thought it was commendable that all of you went through the whole 2 hours. There were no gotcha questions aimed at any particular candidate. No one can leave here thinking this was anything other than a balanced appraisal of the positions of these candidates, and it gave them the opportunity to show their stuff intellectually and politically, and I think they did very well of that. I would address the first question in particular, which they all knew coming out, about first principles and the role of the federal government vis-a-vis the states. I would say the clock seemed to run out on all of them before they got to the federal government vis-a-vis the states. None of them touched on that. I would say 4 of the 5 actually attempted to answer the question and did a good job, but that the clock ran out on that. So I, as an Attorney General in particular, with certain sensitivities to how the federal government deals with states, in my current role, I am particularly interested going forward to hear them fill in that blank. I want to hear very much from these candidates. I want to know what the next president will do when they're confronted with a choice, and Professor George gave them one like it, where their challenge is going with their favored policy, whatever it may be, pro-life, we'll pick an issue, versus leaving control to the states. There is the temptation that always exists when you've got the power to use it. And the Constitution may or may not constrain the use of that power, but the spirit of the Constitution and getting back to a respect for our federalism system of federalism, would dictate that you don't use that power. For instance, in the situation Professor George was confronting, simply not giving courts the appellate authority to take abortion cases would effectively leave abortion to each of the 50 states again. As someone who is parochial and representing a state, I'd like to see states have that authority. I would rather see jurisprudence that doesn't allow something like Roe v. Wade to come into our law, because it is so untethered from the first principles and the foundation of this country. But with it, as we heard here today, there are tools the other branches have. It isn't outrageous, it isn't radical to use what the Constitution has put in place to rein in that out-of-control branch. So I'm looking in the future for more explanation from these candidates who did a good job on the subjects they touched on to address a restrained view, I hope, of the federal government's role vis-a-vis states. And I expect when some of them get specific in terms of what things the federal government should stop doing, you will hear part of that explanation be, and I think that if a state wants to do it, it's for them to pick up. And we'll see how that plays out, but this was truly an outstanding approach to helping all of us to understand what have we got to pick from potential Republican candidates to be our nominee. And I think America would be a lot less cynical, honestly, about the political process if it was this much more substantive rather than the soundbite Coke versus Pepsi gotcha questions that lead so much really to non-substantive and negative and shallow answers. This forum was exactly the opposite, and I think not only would we get better nominees, we would have an American public that is reinvigorated in its appreciation and support for what comes out of the political process.
Thank you, Ken. Let's go to New Hampshire activist Jennifer Horn, president of We the People.
Thank you, Senator and Congressman, and all for inviting us to be part of this. I'm actually going to really ask you a question. Senator DeMint and Congressman King came to New Hampshire in April to be part of a Freedom Forum in our first in the nation state. And we are very excited and take very seriously our partnership with the people of Iowa and South Carolina and New Hampshire together, our really grave responsibility of choosing the next leader of the free world. And in our Freedom Forum, we had the opportunity for me to interview both of you. And you were both talking about the process of choosing the next president and urging voters to hold off on taking sides, to really get to know the candidates, to let more time pass so we could learn more about them. And we ran out of time before I could ask you the last question of my list, which was, are we as activists, or many conservative activists, are we hurting ourselves in the pursuit for conservative purity? And what role does electability play in this process that we go through? Or in your opinion, as you're looking at the candidates and you're giving advice to activists and to voters across the state, across the country, it's so important that we have a strong conservative president with a backbone. Congressman King, we talk about a full spectrum constitutional conservative, but what role does electability play in all of that?
Well, it's kind of like I was told in Washington last year that I didn't understand how things worked. It was about the numbers. It's not about the principles. But I'm convinced, and I've seen it happen, particularly in the last election, that if you have the principles, you'll get the numbers. I believe electability is going to come from people who are telling the truth, who do what we saw up here today, as Ken was saying, that you're less cynical if you allow them to find themselves on their terms. But we saw in the last election a conservative elected in Wisconsin who was not considered electable. Marco Rubio was not considered electable. Rand Paul was not considered electable. Neither was Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania. And so I think the way we've looked at electability in the past has been based on just watering things down to the point that you hope you can draw in those folks who will never support you. I'm convinced that inherent in most Americans, despite generations of government education, is this love of freedom, this love of liberty. And if we call on that, if we call on what's best in people to talk about American opportunity and how prosperity really works, how freedom can work for everyone, I think if we go out there as Republicans, that we can make good candidates electable in tough states. But I'm convinced, and I think history shows it's true, that when Republicans try to behave like Democrats, when we're compromising, when compromise in Washington always means bigger government and more spending. It never means, not in my time there in 12 years, we've never had a compromise that involved actually cutting spending or reducing the size of government. And this thing on purity, there's no such thing as purity in politics. And what I found is if you insist on principle-based decision-making, where these are the things that work, so let's base our decisions on those things that work and that we have evidence that work, then you're accused of purity. But I don't believe principles about purity, because none of the three of us would agree on a lot of policies, but I'm comfortable debating with them because we have the same view of America, and that we're a country based on individual freedom, not central planning and collectivist policies. And so we can debate and move the country in the right direction even if we have disagreements. The problem we have now in Washington is the Democrat Party is to the left of Europe. They have to spend because their platform is based on government dependency and giving away money and creating new programs. If we ever balance the budget, there would be no Democrat Party as we know it today. And so when Republicans try to compromise with that, we end up with something where we lose, America loses. And I think we can convince America that those principles, as we heard today, are good for everyone, and we don't have to change our message for women, for Hispanics, for African Americans. Everyone's going to answer the call of freedom and opportunity.
Let I'm glad you came down, Jennifer, and I hope it was beyond just asking the question we didn't answer in New Hampshire. And thanks for your hospitality in New Hampshire. And I left out a big thank you that I should have said, and that is a big thank you to the presidential candidates. They made this thing all work and did an outstanding job. And that's an omission on my part I'd like to express here. I'd make this point that we should not be looking at this as who's the most electable as the first criterion, because anybody but Obama beats Obama every time in the polls. So that tells us that we can pick, I believe, the president who will do the best job for the United States of America. And I would argue that we are having a huge national debate, and that national debate that I mentioned a little earlier, but this debate is on principle. And if we believe in our principles, if we believe in the Constitution, if we believe in free enterprise, if we believe in American exceptionalism, the full spectrum constitutional conservatism that you mentioned in your question that I often talk about, if we believe in it, why would we think we can't win a debate with the people on the other side of the aisle in a presidential election? I believe in us. And I think that I think also, I wanted to just express this. I mentioned it earlier in the day in a side conversation. It's fresh in my mind. But we should always stand on principle. And if we compromise our principles for the sake of electability, we'll lose our principles. Of course, they're compromised away. And so there was an old quote that I pulled out of my dusty memory and Cal Thomas forgot that he wrote this. But I thought it was very well said. He said, "One searches in vain for statues to greatness that are built upon the foundation of resignation to political reality. Those we revere stood for principled truth, often against great odds. Those we revile, if we remember them at all, compromised or gave up when the going got tough." We have a country to save, and we're going to save it on principle. And I think we've taken a big step here today. Thank you.
Unless the professor wants to jump in, I see some of the South Carolina delegation. Tim, Trey, anyone want to make a comment? I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't want to talk. Maybe I'll just let folks raise their hands. Go ahead, Trey.
Senator, since you're a constituent, I'm not going to ask you a question.
Thank you.
Representative King, you're a colleague. I'm not going to ask you a question. I've always wanted to ask a professor a question, so got so many bad memories from law school of having it reversed. Brennan, Souter, Warren, John Paul Stevens. What do they have in common?
They were all appointed by Republican presidents.
That's exactly right. So my question, I guess, to the whole panel is, at what point is it appropriate to ask specifically, we ask about vice presidential candidates, at what point is it appropriate to ask, what are you looking for in a Supreme Court justice? And again, Professor George, the most important first principle to me is how elastic these candidates view the Commerce Clause as being, because that is the clause that is used to expand the size and scope of the federal government more than any other clause. Are you satisfied that you have a sufficient understanding of how they will interpret the Commerce Clause as a result of today?
Well, I would like to know more, and of course we couldn't get to every possible line of questioning that we would like to have pursued. Here's the problem. For 40 years, more than 40 years, going back to Eisenhower, 50, 60, Republican presidents or Republican presidential aspirants have all said the same thing. Yes, if elected, I will appoint, Nixon called them strict constructionists. And then later they were called advocates of judicial restraint. And later than that, true constitutionalists. People who would construe the Constitution in light of the text and the structure and the original understanding of the document. Yet, those very same presidents, once in power, have given us not only the people that you mentioned, the justices that you mentioned, but Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, federal U.S. Court of Appeals judges and trial judges who were not faithful strict constructionists or judicial restraint judges or constitutionalists. So that simple assurance, the kind of stock answer that I will appoint someone who will interpret the law and not make the law, is one that we're just not satisfied with anymore. So we need to know more about their attitude toward the respective roles of the elected branches and the judiciary. And I tried to elicit a little bit of that today with each of the candidates.
They tell me we just have one more question, and I forgot to get to the legendary Iowa radio talk show host, Jan Michelson. Jan, give us a parting comment, and then unless someone has to say something, we'll just dismiss and call it a day.
Thank you, Senator. It's a real pleasure being invited to participate in this forum. After you participated in many in Iowa, we appreciate the reciprocity. Got started here in Columbia, South Carolina as a talk show host at then WIS Radio. And being back here brought back a flood of very positive memories. And remembering that the guy who designed your streets was compass impaired. And then I remembered why. It was to confuse Yankees, and let me tell you, it's still working. And for the record, Professor George, the people here in South Carolina would be way too polite to tell you this, but the 14th Amendment was never legally ratified.
Yeah. The southern states were away that day.
I think we were sent away. Anyway, back to the straw poll in Iowa was our first date with the presidential candidates, and Bachmann and Ron Paul finished very close 1 and 2. And hearkening to what she said just a few moments ago from New Hampshire about the divide in the party between social conservatives and fiscal conservatives. The fiscals say jobs, 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 shut up about everything else. The social conservatives say, yeah, jobs important, obviously important. However, if you don't get life and family correct, we don't trust you with the checkbook. How do we reconcile? Are those notions reconcilable? And if we have time for a second question, the issue of American exceptionalism has come up over and over today. What's the difference between American exceptionalism and old-fashioned nationalism? Thank you.
Sure. Let me take a quick crack at both of them. I think it's very, very important to the future of the Republican Party and to the future of the country that we understand that the marriage of economic and social conservatism is not a marriage of convenience. It is a marriage of principle. In fact, we shouldn't be categorized as economic conservatives or social conservatives. We should be conservatives because it's the same fundamental principles that are behind the economic conservative philosophy and the social conservative philosophy. I was able to get into this a little bit with Mr. Kane. Look, we know, the data is now clear, that poverty is highly associated with the breakdown of the marriage culture. Wherever you go in the marriage culture has broken down, the poverty rates skyrocket, right? So it's really true that if you're serious about the economic well-being of our people, then you should be concerned with two things, one of which generally falls into the economic category and the other generally into the social category. But they are united, and that is a vibrant market economy that will generate employment, good jobs. And number two, preserving the institution of marriage and rebuilding the marriage culture. You cannot bring about the prosperity of our people with only one of those. It's got to be both. So that's a marriage of principle, not a marriage of convenience. To the second point about American exceptionalism and why it's just not old-fashioned nationalism, it's because of this. It's that we are a creedal nation. What unites us is not blood or soil or even a common religion. What unites us across the lines of historical theological division, across the lines of race, across the lines of ethnicity, is the commitment to the proposition that all men are created equal. We're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's the belief in that that makes us an American. You can become a French citizen, but you can't just become a Frenchman. If a fellow from Singapore wants to become a French citizen, doable. If he wants to become a Frenchman, not so doable. Or a Swede, or an Italian. But that Singaporean can become not only an American citizen, he can become an American as the guys who came over, the descendants of the guys who came over on the Mayflower. That's the difference between American exceptionalism and just nationalism.
I really don't think I can improve on Robbie's answer to that, Jan. I would just say get married, stay married, get a job, keep a job, don't abuse substance, and that'll be about 99% of our social pathologies improved. Fix that.
And the poverty, that one.
And we are perhaps the last redoubt of Western civilization, and that's what I would add to what I've heard from Professor George. But thank you very much.
I think as conservatives, there is a distinction we have to make to the rest of the country, that we don't want to use the force of government to push our morals or religion on anyone else. But we do want the government to stop purging values just because they may be derived from biblical faith from our culture. The culture is the single most important fiscal issue and economic issue. As Professor George has said, I mean, the spending in Washington on families that have broken down, aid to dependent children, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, the dependency problem, what it does to our culture. Social issues is key. I mean, because you track the breakdown of family, you have school dropouts. The chances of a school dropout getting a good job today, very slim. It certainly correlates with juvenile delinquency, incarceration, drug use. So it's a huge fiscal issue. But we just need to make the distinction. When we talk about social issues, what we want to make sure first, the federal government stops having policies that create perverse incentives to break up the family, unwed births, for people to be dependent on the government, paying them not to work. Those are social issues that are caused by bad federal policy. So we don't need the government to establish our values, but we need to make sure the government allows our culture to set its own standards and values, and I think you would see a lot of self-correction take place. Again, thanks everyone for being here. We probably should wrap it up. Thank townhall.com for streaming this out to the rest of the country. Look forward to following up with a lot of you, and again, you made this a great event. Appreciate you being here.